Arrival at the crossroads. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint hum of distant engines as passengers bustled through the modern architecture of the International Departure Terminal. The airport was a symphony of movement, voices rising and falling in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Among the sea of travelers, Camille Hart stepped gracefully into the Priority Lounge, a space designed to reflect exclusivity and luxury. She was a striking woman in her late 30s, dressed in a tailored emerald green pantsuit that accentuated her regal poise. Her natural curls framed her face, complementing her luminous brown skin and confident demeanor. Camille wasn't just any traveler, she was the CEO of Hartwell Innovations, a leading tech firm on the brink of finalizing a groundbreaking contract with the very airline whose lounge she had entered. Her presence in the room was a testament to her success, but to the staff and some patrons, it seemed to be a point of contention. As she approached the check-in desk, her confidence drew attention. 2 attendants stood behind the counter. One, a young woman with a kind smile, greeted Camille warmly. The other, an older man with a stiff posture and scrutinizing eyes, surveyed her as if searching for flaws. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass and membership card?" the younger woman asked. Camille retrieved her leather wallet from her Hermès bag and handed over the required documents with a polite nod. The older man leaned over, squinting at the card before shooting a glance at Camille that carried an air of skepticism. He took the card from his colleague's hand and inspected it with exaggerated care. One moment, he said curtly, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. Camille raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had seen this act before, a performance of doubt cast upon her credentials. A few moments later, he returned with a woman who appeared to be in charge. Her name tag read Margaret, Lounge Manager, and her demeanor matched the title. Margaret had a certain aura about her, one that combined authority with a veneer of politeness masking something more disconcerting. Her sharp eyes met Camille's, and her lips curved into a smile that felt anything but welcoming. "Ms. Hart," Margaret began, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm afraid we need to verify your membership status. We've had issues with, shall we say, unauthorized use of these privileges." Camille's posture remained impeccable, but her eyes narrowed. "Unauthorized use," she echoed, her voice steady but edged with steel. "This is my Platinum Priority membership, issued directly by Skyline Air after 5 years of loyal patronage. Feel free to verify as thoroughly as you need." Margaret hesitated, seemingly caught off guard by Camille's calm but commanding response. She took the card and retreated to a computer, typing with deliberate slowness. Camille stood at the counter, aware of the quiet whispers spreading among other guests in the lounge. Her every movement was under scrutiny, her presence questioned as though it were an anomaly in this space. The verification process stretched on far longer than necessary. Margaret returned with an overly saccharine smile. "Everything checks out, Ms. Hart. However, I must remind our members to maintain the decorum expected in a space of this caliber." Camille tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for your reminder," she said, her tone unyielding. "I'll be sure to inform my team that Skyline Air has such high expectations for its guests." Margaret blinked, unsure whether to interpret the statement as agreement or challenge. Before she could respond, Camille had already turned away, finding a seat near the lounge's panoramic window. From her vantage point, she could see the sprawling runway, where planes ascended into the sky with a freedom that contrasted starkly with the judgment-laden atmosphere she had just endured. She retrieved her laptop and began reviewing a document. The proposal for the contract she was negotiating with Skyline Air was the culmination of months of work. It promised to revolutionize the airline's operational efficiency with Hartwell Innovations' proprietary AI systems. But as Camille's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the sting of the earlier encounter lingered. The whispers and stares hadn't gone unnoticed. She caught snippets of conversations. "How did she get in here?" and "maybe she's with someone important." It wasn't the first time she had faced such microaggressions, but this one carried a unique bitterness. She thought of the countless hours she had spent earning her place in rooms like this, and a quiet resolve settled over her. Camille's phone vibrated, pulling her attention back. The name on the screen read Victor Ellis. Victor was her firm's legal advisor and one of her closest confidants. She swiped to answer. Victor, she greeted, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of frustration. I'm at the Skyline Priority Lounge, and let's just say their definition of hospitality leaves much to be desired. Victor's deep voice responded with concern. What happened? Camille recounted the incident succinctly, keeping her emotions in check. As she spoke, she noticed Margaret and the older attendant casting glances her way, their whispers barely concealed. This isn't just about me, Camille concluded. It's about what their behavior says about the culture here. I won't let it slide. Victor chuckled darkly. Do you want me to draft a response, or are you handling this your way? Camille smiled faintly. You know me. I'll handle it. As she ended the call, Margaret's phone rang at the counter. Camille watched as the manager answered, her confident demeanor faltering as the conversation progressed. The shift in Margaret's expression, confusion, then unease, did not escape Camille's notice. It was a small ripple in what promised to become a much larger wave. Camille leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm determination washing over her. The next 6 minutes would set the stage for a confrontation that would not only challenge the arrogance she had endured, but also reshape the narrative of power and respect in the spaces she occupied. The storm was coming, and Camille was ready. The tension in the lounge was palpable as Margaret's phone call dragged on. Camille sat in her corner seat, her focus divided between her laptop screen and the unfolding scene at the counter. Margaret's usual confidence had drained away, her hand gripped the receiver tightly, and her lips were pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Occasionally, her gaze darted toward Camille, and the subtle flush in her cheeks betrayed her discomfort. The staff who had shared glances of mockery earlier were now whispering amongst themselves, their amusement replaced by a growing curiosity. Camille took a sip of water, her expression calm, almost disinterested. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing notes, but her thoughts were anything but calm. Every keystroke was deliberate, a silent testament to her resolve. Her entire career had been about overcoming barriers. From boardrooms filled with skeptical glances to partnerships forged in the face of doubt, she had learned that every slight, no matter how small, was a chance to define her own narrative. Margaret abruptly ended her call, placing the receiver down with more force than necessary. She muttered something to the older attendant, who nodded stiffly and hurried off. The manager then straightened her blazer, clearly trying to compose herself. Camille's phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Victor, "Ready if you are. Just say the word." Camille didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around the lounge, taking in the subtle shifts in atmosphere. The couple seated near her, who had exchanged whispered comments earlier, now avoided eye contact. A businessman scrolling through his phone in the far corner occasionally glanced her way, his curiosity poorly concealed. Camille knew that many in the room had already formed their judgments about her before she had even spoken a word. But what they didn't know was that she held far more power than they could imagine. Margaret finally approached, her smile forced and her demeanor overly polite. "Miss Hart, I hope you're finding everything satisfactory now," she said, her tone teetering on the edge of condescension. Camille looked up from her laptop, her expression unreadable. "Is there something I can assist you with, Margaret?" she asked, her voice measured. The manager faltered slightly, clearly unprepared for the directness. "No, not at all," she stammered. "I just wanted to ensure that you're comfortable and to let you know we're here to assist with anything you might need." Camille nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I appreciate your concern. However, I've already experienced enough of your assistance today." Margaret opened her mouth as if to respond, but Camille raised a hand, silencing her. "Before you say anything else, let me be clear. I've documented every part of this experience, your insinuations, the unnecessary delay, and the blatant disrespect I've endured. And believe me, this is far from over." Margaret's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure. "Miss Hart, I assure you. You don't need to assure me of anything, Camille interrupted, her voice firm but calm. What you need to do is reflect on why you believed it was appropriate to question my presence here, despite having all the necessary credentials in your hand. And while you're at it, you might want to consider the potential consequences of such behavior. Before Margaret could respond, Camille's phone buzzed with another call. This time, the name displayed was Paul Jennings, Skyline Air Executive Team. Camille held Margaret's gaze for a moment longer before answering the call. Paul, she greeted, her tone professional but with an unmistakable edge. I trust you've been briefed on the situation? Paul's voice on the other end was nervous, but attempting to project authority. Yes, Ms. Hart. I've been made aware of some misunderstandings in the lounge. I want to personally apologize on behalf of Skyline Air. Camille's lips curved into a small smile, though her eyes remained cold. A misunderstanding, Paul? Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels more like a systemic issue. Paul hesitated. I assure you, Skyline Air takes these matters very seriously. We value your patronage and deeply regret any discomfort you've experienced. Camille leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. Paul, let me be clear. This isn't just about discomfort. This is about a culture within your organization that permits and perpetuates this kind of behavior. If it happened to me, you can be certain it's happened to others, likely those without the resources or platform to address it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Hart, Paul began cautiously, I understand your frustration. Please allow us the opportunity to rectify this. Camille's voice hardened. Rectify? That's a nice word, Paul. But let me tell you what's going to happen next. I've already spoken to my team, and they're preparing to review every aspect of the contract we've been negotiating with Skyline Air. If I don't see a genuine commitment to addressing this issue, not just with me but across your entire organization, you can consider that contract void. Paul's response was immediate. Ms. Hart, please. Let's not make any hasty decisions. We highly value our partnership with Hartwell Innovations. Camille allowed a small, humorless laugh to escape. Hasty? Paul, I think 6 minutes is more than enough time to evaluate the integrity of a company. And right now, Skyline Air is falling short. She ended the call before he could respond, her decision final. Setting her phone down, she glanced at Margaret, who now stood frozen a few feet away, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. Ms. Hart, Margaret began, her voice faltering. I assure you this isn't how we typically operate. Camille stood, her movements deliberate and powerful. She towered over Margaret, not just in stature, but in presence. Margaret, she said, her tone icy, it's not enough to assure me. Actions speak louder than words. And trust me, I'll be watching. As Camille gathered her belongings, the lounge fell silent. Every eye was on her, but this time, there was no judgment, only a mix of curiosity and unease. She walked toward the exit with the same grace and confidence she had entered, leaving behind an air of uncertainty that lingered long after the glass doors slid shut behind her. Outside the lounge, Camille's assistant, Natalie, was waiting with a concerned expression. Everything okay, Ms. Hart? She asked. Camille nodded, her calm exterior belying the storm within. Everything's fine, Natalie. Let's head to the gate. As they walked, Natalie hesitated before speaking again. I just got an email from Victor. He mentioned something about the Skyline contract being under review? Camille smiled faintly. That's correct. Make sure the team prioritizes alternatives. We're not tying ourselves to a company that doesn't align with our values. Natalie nodded, her admiration for Camille evident. Understood. As they approached the gate, Camille felt a sense of satisfaction. This was more than a victory for herself, it was a statement, a refusal to accept the subtle and not-so-subtle indignities that so many were forced to endure. She had turned the narrative, ensuring that those who had wronged her would face the consequences of their actions. Camille boarded the plane, her mind already moving to the next steps. This wasn't the end of the story, far from it. This was only the beginning of a larger reckoning, one that would ensure the power she wielded would be used to create lasting change. And as the plane ascended into the sky, leaving the airport and its microcosm of prejudice far below, Camille felt lighter, freer, and more determined than ever. The private conference room of Hartwell Innovation's downtown headquarters was awash with the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. Camille sat at the head of the sleek, glass-topped table, her fingers steepled in thought. Around her, the senior leadership team of her company was gathered, their expressions ranging from concerned to curious. Victor, ever the composed legal mind, leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping rhythmically against a leather-bound notebook. Natalie, Camille's sharp and intuitive assistant, was seated to her right, typing notes with quiet efficiency. Before we begin, Camille started, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. I want to make one thing clear: the events that transpired in that lounge yesterday are not just a personal affront. They are a reflection of a systemic problem within Skyline Air's corporate culture. And as leaders of this company, it is our responsibility to decide how we move forward. She paused, allowing her words to settle in the room. The silence was heavy, charged with the gravity of the situation. Then, Victor spoke. We've already initiated a preliminary review of the Skyline contract, he said, his tone measured. If we were to pull out now, it would undoubtedly send a strong message, but we need to consider the potential ramifications. This is a significant partnership for both parties. Camille nodded. I'm aware of the stakes, Victor. But let me ask you this: what message are we sending if we continue this partnership without addressing the root of the problem? Skyline's behavior, as exemplified by their staff, is not just unprofessional. It's emblematic of a larger issue, one that we cannot afford to overlook. Natalie chimed in, her voice firm but respectful. I've done some digging, and it seems this isn't an isolated incident. There have been multiple reports from customers and even former employees about discriminatory practices within Skyline Air. Most of these reports were buried under PR spin, but the patterns are clear. Camille's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only fueled her determination. If this is a pattern, then it's even more imperative that we take a stand. We cannot align ourselves with a company that tolerates or perpetuates such behavior. Another executive, Derek, the company's CFO, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. I understand where you're coming from, Camille, but we have to be pragmatic. This contract is worth millions. Walking away could impact our growth trajectory. Camille's eyes met his, unwavering. Derek, Hartwell Innovations, didn't get to where it is today by compromising on our principles. Yes, this contract is valuable, but what's more valuable is our integrity. If we allow financial gain to dictate our actions, we lose sight of who we are and what we stand for. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing against the walls. Then Victor spoke once more, his tone contemplative. If we're serious about this, we need a strategy, one that not only protects us legally but also ensures that our message is clear and impactful. Camille nodded. Agreed. I've already drafted a statement outlining our position, but I want your input before we make it public. This isn't just about cutting ties with Skyline. It's about setting a precedent, not just for us, but for the industry as a whole. She gestured to Natalie, who projected the statement onto a screen at the far end of the room. The words were succinct but powerful. Hartwell Innovations is committed to fostering a culture of respect, equity, and inclusion. Recent events involving Skyline Air have brought to light behaviors and practices that are fundamentally misaligned with our values. As such, we are suspending all negotiations with Skyline Air until meaningful changes are implemented. We believe in holding ourselves and our partners to the highest ethical standards, and we encourage Skyline Air to take this opportunity to reflect and improve. The team read the statement in silence, their expressions thoughtful. After a moment, Derek spoke again. It's strong, but not inflammatory. I think it strikes the right balance. Victor nodded in agreement. Legally, it's solid. It doesn't accuse them directly of anything actionable, but it makes our position clear. Camille leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping over her team. Then it's settled. Natalie, finalize the statement and coordinate with our PR team to release it by the end of the day. Victor, I want you to prepare a contingency plan in case Skyline decides to retaliate. And Derek, start exploring alternative partnerships. We need to show that we're not just walking away from Skyline, we're walking towards something better. As the meeting adjourned, Camille remained in her seat, her thoughts churning. She knew this was only the beginning. Skyline Air was a powerful entity, and their response would likely be swift and calculated. But she was ready. She had spent her entire career navigating challenges far greater than this, and she wasn't about to back down now. That evening, as the statement went live, the response was immediate. Social media lit up with discussions, debates, and declarations of support. Many praised Hartwell Innovations for taking a stand, while others questioned the wisdom of jeopardizing such a lucrative partnership. Camille monitored the reactions with a measured eye, knowing that every word, every comment, every headline was shaping the narrative. The next morning, her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. Among them was an email from Paul Jennings, the Skyline executive she had spoken to in the lounge. His tone, once dismissive, was now markedly different. Ms. Hart, I have read your statement and would like to express my deepest regret for the incident in the Priority Lounge. Skyline Air values its partnership with Hartwell Innovations, and we are committed to addressing the concerns you've raised. I would like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss how we can move forward. Camille read the email carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't trust Paul's sudden change of tone, but she knew it was a step in the right direction. The question now was whether Skyline's promises would translate into meaningful action. Later that day, Camille sat in her office, overlooking the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the towering buildings. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the battles fought, the barriers broken, and the resilience cultivated. This moment was just another chapter in a much larger story, one that was still being written. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Natalie. Paul Jennings and his team have requested a video conference tomorrow morning. Shall I confirm? Camille's response was swift, confirm. Let's see if they're ready to do more than just talk. As she put her phone down, Camille allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The events of the past few days had been draining, but they had also reaffirmed her purpose. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a leader, a trailblazer, and a force for change. And as she prepared for the battles ahead, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Camille Hart was ready. The world might not have expected her to rise, but rise she did, and she wasn't done yet. The glow of the city reflected off the glass walls of Hartwell Innovations headquarters as Camille prepared for the video conference with Skyline Air. She had spent the evening meticulously reviewing the airline's history, studying their corporate structure, public relations strategies, and internal reports that Natalie had uncovered. It was clear to her now that the incident in the lounge was symptomatic of a deeper problem, a culture that allowed prejudice to fester under the guise of professionalism. Camille wasn't just confronting the affront she had experienced, she was challenging an entire system. At precisely 9 a.m., Natalie entered Camille's office, with a quiet knock. The conference is set up, Ms. Hart. Paul Jennings and his team are on the call. Camille nodded, adjusting the emerald green blazer she had chosen deliberately, a nod to the outfit she had worn in the lounge, a subtle but pointed statement. She followed Natalie into the adjacent conference room, where the large monitor displayed a polished virtual boardroom. On one side sat Paul Jennings, his face carefully neutral, flanked by two other Skyline executives, a man and a woman who both exuded corporate precision. Good morning, Ms. Hart, Paul began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed every word. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We understand the gravity of the situation and want to begin by offering our sincerest apologies for the incident you experienced in our lounge. Camille leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but unreadable. Good morning, Mr. Jennings, she replied. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the incident, but I must make it clear that this meeting is not about apologies. It's about accountability and action. Paul nodded, his smile tight. Understood. I want to assure you that we are committed to addressing this matter comprehensively. We've already initiated an internal review of our policies and practices, starting with staff training on implicit bias and customer service standards. Camille raised an eyebrow. That's a start, but training sessions alone are not enough. What guarantees can you provide that this will lead to meaningful change and not just a temporary PR effort? The female executive, whose name tag read Elena Ruiz, leaned forward, her tone conciliatory. Ms. Hart, I've been tasked with leading this initiative, and I can assure you we are taking this very seriously. We are implementing a third-party audit of our operations to identify systemic issues and will be forming a diversity and inclusion advisory board. Camille's gaze shifted to Elena, studying her carefully. An audit and an advisory board are commendable steps, but they lack teeth and less tied to tangible outcomes. How will you ensure accountability at every level of your organization? Paul interjected, his tone a mix of diplomacy and defensiveness. We're prepared to take significant measures, Ms. Hart. We value our partnership with Hartwell Innovations and recognize the importance of aligning with your values. Camille didn't miss the calculated phrasing. Partnership and values were clearly meant to appeal to her. She allowed a moment of silence to stretch, watching as Paul shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Mr. Jennings, she said finally, her voice steady, words like partnership and values mean nothing without action. Let me be clear, this is not about salvaging our contract. This is about whether Skyline Air is willing to confront the realities of its culture and make the necessary changes. Anything less, and we have no foundation for collaboration. Paul hesitated, clearly weighing his response. What would you consider sufficient action, Ms. Hart? Camille leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. For starters, I want transparency. Publish the findings of your audit publicly and commit to addressing every issue identified. Second, I want to see measurable benchmarks for improvement, diversity metrics, retention rates, customer satisfaction scores, updated quarterly and made available to your stakeholders. Third, I expect a formal acknowledgement of the incident in the lounge, accompanied by a clear commitment to doing better. The other executive, a man named Charles Benton, frowned slightly. Ms. Hart, with all due respect, these demands are unprecedented. Transparency at that level could expose us to significant scrutiny. Camille's lips curved into a faint smile. Exactly. That's the point. If you're serious about change, you'll welcome that scrutiny. Anything less suggests you have something to hide. Charles glanced at Paul, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Elena, however, nodded. She's right, Elena said, her voice firm. Transparency is the only way to rebuild trust. We can't ask for public confidence without showing that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. Paul's expression tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. We'll need to discuss this internally, but I understand your position, Ms. Hart. We want to move forward in a way that reflects our commitment to improvement. Camille's smile didn't reach her eyes. Good. But let me be clear, this is not a negotiation. These are the terms under which Hartwell Innovations will even consider re-entering discussions with Skyline Air. If you're unwilling to meet them, we have no reason to continue this conversation. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Paul seemed to wilt slightly under the pressure. Understood, he said finally. We'll follow up with a detailed proposal addressing your concerns. The call ended shortly after, and Camille leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Natalie, who had been quietly observing from the side, approached with a smile. That was masterful, she said. You didn't just hold them accountable, you forced them to confront their own shortcomings. Camille smiled faintly. That's the goal, Natalie. This isn't just about me. It's about setting a precedent. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of Camille's stand against Skyline Air became evident. The airline's internal struggles, which had long been whispered about, were now front-page news. Journalists unearthed stories of other incidents similar to Camille's, amplifying the narrative that Skyline's culture was deeply flawed. In response, the airline announced sweeping reforms, including the steps Camille had demanded during the call. Hartwell Innovations, meanwhile, thrived in the face of the controversy. The decision to suspend negotiations with Skyline Air earned widespread praise, solidifying the company's reputation as a principled and forward-thinking leader in the tech industry. Alternative partnerships emerged, including a lucrative deal with a global airline renowned for its progressive values. One evening, as Camille reviewed the latest reports in her office, Natalie entered with a printed letter. "This just came for you," she said, handing it over. Camille unfolded the letter and read it carefully. It was from Elena Ruiz, now heading Skyline Air's newly formed Diversity and Accountability Division. The letter expressed gratitude for Camille's leadership and included an update on the airline's progress, along with an invitation to speak at their upcoming corporate summit. Camille's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. She had no intention of accepting the invitation, at least not yet. But the letter was proof that change was possible, even in the most resistant of institutions. As she gazed out her office window at the city lights, Camille felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned a moment of indignity into a movement for change, proving that power was not about dominance, but about the ability to inspire and demand better. The fight wasn't over, there were always more battles to be fought, more barriers to break. But for now, Camille Hart knew she had made a difference. And that, she decided, was a legacy worth building. Weeks turned into months, and the ripples of Camille's bold stance against Skyline Air continued to reshape the corporate and social landscape. For many, her actions had come to symbolize the growing demand for accountability in institutions that had long operated with unchecked privilege. Skyline Air, once a towering figure of prestige, now stood as a cautionary tale of what happened when organizations failed to align their values with the expectations of an increasingly discerning public. Camille's life, however, was anything but static. The momentum she had sparked required nurturing, and the attention her company received opened doors to opportunities and challenges alike. As CEO of Hartwell Innovations, she understood the importance of capitalizing on the moment without losing sight of the principles that had brought her to this point. One crisp autumn morning, Camille arrived at Hartwell Innovations headquarters, where a group of reporters had gathered outside. The release of Skyline Air's first quarterly diversity and accountability report had drawn significant media attention. The report, which included transparency metrics Camille had demanded, revealed both progress and lingering gaps within the airline's operations. For the press, it was a perfect story, a redemption arc in progress, with Camille Hart at its center. As she stepped out of her sleek black car, cameras clicked, and voices called out. "Ms. Hart, how do you feel about Skyline Air's progress? Do you believe they've done enough to regain public trust? Is Hartwell Innovations planning to renew its partnership with Skyline?" Camille paused briefly, turning toward the crowd with a composed smile. "Good morning. While I commend Skyline Air for taking the initial steps toward transparency and accountability, true change requires sustained effort. My focus remains on ensuring that Hartwell Innovations continues to set a standard for integrity in all our partnerships. Thank you." With that, she walked through the revolving doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she entered the lobby. Inside, Natalie was waiting, her tablet in hand and a knowing look on her face. "You handled that beautifully," Natalie said as they stepped into the private elevator. "Thank you," Camille replied. "But the real work is just beginning. Public scrutiny can be a powerful motivator, but it's consistency that builds trust." The elevator ascended smoothly to the top floor, where the executive team was gathered for a quarterly strategy meeting. As Camille entered the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted. Her leadership had always commanded respect, but in the wake of her actions against Skyline Air, her presence carried an almost palpable weight. Victor, ever the steady legal mind, opened the meeting. Before we dive into today's agenda, I want to acknowledge the impact of Camille's leadership over the past few months. The decision to hold Skyline Air accountable wasn't just a moral stand, it's become a defining moment for our company. The positive response from clients, partners, and the public has been overwhelming. A round of applause followed, but Camille raised a hand, her expression modest. Thank you, Victor, and thank you all. But let's not lose sight of what this means for us as a company. We've set a precedent, and now we have to live up to it. That means holding ourselves to the same standards we expect from others. The meeting progressed with updates on ongoing projects, new partnerships, and the company's financial performance. Derek, the CFO, presented a report highlighting how Hartwell Innovations had not only recovered from the initial fallout with Skyline Air, but had exceeded revenue projections thanks to new alliances with companies that shared their values. After the meeting, Camille returned to her office, where an unexpected email awaited her. The subject line read, Invitation to Keynote Address, Global Leadership Summit. Intrigued, she opened it to find a formal invitation from one of the world's most prestigious conferences on corporate leadership and social impact. The summit organizers had specifically requested Camille as the keynote speaker, citing her unwavering commitment to ethical leadership and transformative change. She leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. The invitation felt like a culmination of everything she had worked for, not just in the past few months, but throughout her entire career. Yet it was also a reminder of the responsibility she now carried. The platform she had built came with expectations, and she was determined to use it wisely. Later that evening, Camille found herself sitting in her living room, a glass of wine in hand as she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The Skyline Air incident was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that had begun years ago when she first entered the corporate world as a young woman of color in an industry dominated by men who had underestimated her at every turn. She thought about the countless obstacles she had faced, the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, and the victories that had paved the way for others. She thought about the people who had doubted her and the mentors who had believed in her. And she thought about the responsibility she now bore as a symbol of progress, knowing that every decision she made would be scrutinized and every word she spoke would carry weight. The next morning, Camille arrived at the office earlier than usual. She had made her decision about the keynote invitation and wanted to begin preparing. Natalie was already at her desk, as efficient and intuitive as ever. I saw the email about the summit, Natalie said with a grin. Let me guess, you're going to accept. Camille nodded. Yes, but this isn't just about me. I want to use this opportunity to highlight the work we're doing as a company and the broader movement we're trying to build. Over the next few weeks, Camille poured herself into crafting her keynote address. She worked closely with her team, incorporating stories of resilience, examples of corporate accountability, and a vision for what leadership could look like in a world that prioritized equity and inclusion. She knew that her words would resonate far beyond the summit, shaping conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and communities around the globe. When the day of the summit arrived, Camille stood backstage, her heart steady, but her mind alive with anticipation. The audience beyond the curtain was filled with CEOs, policymakers, academics, and activists, all waiting to hear from her. As the announcer introduced her, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, the applause swelling around her. The room was silent as Camille began to speak, her voice calm but powerful. She shared her journey, the lessons she had learned, and the vision she held for a future where businesses didn't just measure success by profit but by the impact they had on the world. She spoke of the Skyline Air incident, not as a moment of triumph, but as a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. For too long, she said, her gaze sweeping the audience, we've accepted a world where accountability is an afterthought, where inclusivity is treated as a box to check rather than a value to uphold. But I believe we can do better. I believe we must do better. And it starts with each of us, every decision we make, every partnership we form, every standard we set. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Camille knew that the true measure of her impact wouldn't be found in the cheers of the crowd. It would be found in the actions that followed, in the leaders who left that room inspired to make change, in the companies that chose integrity over convenience, and in the people who would no longer settle for less than they deserved. As she stepped off the stage, Camille felt a sense of clarity and purpose that was stronger than ever. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Because in a world that often underestimated her, Camille Hart had proven time and again that she was not only capable of rising to the challenge, she was capable of redefining it. And she wasn't done yet.